Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Hello to everyone out there. This is
Yeah.
Tony Hunt and
And Caleb Roberts. We're the co-editors of the Hour magazine, which if you're listening to this, you probably know, but it's a magazine online that we founded. It's crazy, like late 2019, so almost 4 years ago.
oh Lord.
And isn't that insane?
Oh man.
And it's been on a bit of a hiatus. Sorry about that. But it's because reasons. But most importantly, we're here in the meantime to satiate your longings for some good content, some good discourse that really gets to one of the founding reasons why we started the mag in the first place, which is to expose people to what is this unknown, obscure thing that shouldn't be. And that is the tradition of the Anglican left. Uh, and that's something that is in some ways easier said literally on a podcast than it is in writing. Certainly less time consuming, though our tech difficulties tonight would seem to suggest otherwise. But we are going to serenade you all with a chapter by chapter run through and commentary of the great Vida Dutton Scudder's book, Socialism and Character. And again, I'm Caleb Roberts, and this with me is my friend, comrade, co-editor, Tony Hunt.
The very name of the magazine is taken from a work from Scudder. Um, and you'll have to forgive us if we switch between Vita and Vida. I've inherently always said Vita. People
Oh,
have
really?
people have emailed me to ask if it's Vita or Vida. And I have heard it said both ways by historians of the church and and all that. Vita makes sense, right? But maybe it's the classicist Latin in me. That
Yeah,
that's probably
like
what it
that,
is.
like that Venite Venite
Yeah,
nonsense. Okay,
yeah,
all right, cool. Both of them sound like a healthy snack, so either one's good, I think.
indeed. And I'm almost reminded of Vidalia onions for whatever
Yeah,
reason. Right?
yeah,
Good
yeah.
sweet Southern onions.
Yeah. Sometimes too sweet, in my opinion. Like once you caramelize them, it's just like candy. I don't know.
Yeah,
There
yeah,
were those
yeah.
really, there were those chips in the 2000s that were like Vidalia onion flavor, and I just I wasn't a huge fan of those. But I love me some sour cream and onion chips, but just keep it old school. No need to Vidalia the chips. But anyway, it's Vita, whatever. Both of them can mean life, and she had a pretty cool one. Um, do you want to just go in straight in with bio stuff for Vida Dutton Scudder, and we go into it? Does that sound good?
Yeah, we should go right into it with some biographical
Yes.
background for her and again we're gonna read through this major work of hers, Socialism and Character, chapter by chapter, discuss its content and its possible lingering meaning for us in our current context. But take it away with
Yes.
the bio, Caleb.
Cool. We'll do. Okay, so I'm getting most of this stuff from a paper that I found. It was published in the Journal of Anglican and Episcopal History all the way back in 1993, so 20, 30 years ago. Oh, man. Uh, but that itself is indicative of how hard it can be to find secondary literature on Vida Dutton Scudder, which is a shame. And this little podcast is one small effort to remedy that obscurity. But anyway, I'm getting this from a paper called Creating a Cooperative Commonwealth, long subtitle, but is written by Gary Scott Smith, presumably a historian. And again, this is from Anglican and Episcopal history. So, Vida Dutton Scudder is born in 1861 in India. I think Madurai was the city, though I'm not entirely confident of that. But she's born in India, 1861, to Congregationalist missionary parents. Tragically, her father drowns when she is still a baby, and that prompts her and her mother to return to Boston, where I assume they lived beforehand, but I'm not entirely sure. In any case, they move there after her father's death. She is a lifelong Episcopalian, as far as I know, but at the very least, she is confirmed as a teenager at Trinity Church, Boston, during the tenure of Philip Brooks, a pretty famous Episcopal priest from the 19th century. He even has a day on Lesser Feast and Fast. It's January 23rd, I believe, which is pretty cool. So she's got that Episcopal cred all the way starting back in her teenage years. Later on, shortly after, she becomes one of the first American women to study at Oxford University, where this is super cool. She gets to attend lectures by none other than John Ruskin. And apparently, his book, Unto This Last, which is a great book, was a formative influence for her during those years. As she is studying and entering into young adulthood, she becomes disenchanted, or at least discontent, with the relatively affluent nature of her upbringing. And she begins to explore the slums in both London and Boston to acquaint herself with the plight of the working classes and the poor, during which, after she is exposed to John Ruskin, she continues her study of great folks like Tolstoy, F.D. Morris, who Tony has written about before in the mag, and Bakunin. And apparently, the final push for her full conversion to socialist ideology was the first volume of the Fabian Essays. So this is already clearly linking her with that English tradition of the left via the Fabians. She returns after completing her studies at Oxford, where she takes on a position in the English department of Wellesley College. I never know how to pronounce that entirely correctly, but I think it's Wellesley College.
I think that's right, yeah.
So as I was saying, so she belongs to several organizations, both of the Christian left and left more broadly, which is the Society of Christian Socialists, founded by another Episcopal priest, W.D.P. Bliss, in Boston. Pretty short-lived. It's founded in 1889, but dissolves by 1896. But there's also the Christian Socialist Fellowship that she's involved with, the Church Socialist League, the Church League for Industrial Democracy, the Socialist Party in America, of course, and on the more devotional side, the Society of Companions of the Holy Cross, which is a devotional guild of Episcopal women back in those days.
And today.
Great. I wasn't sure if they're still active. That's fantastic.
They are. Yep.
That is rad. Cool. So about her sort of literary or her intellectual output, Gary Scott Smith, again, the guy that I'm drawing a lot of this stuff in his paper, he says, quote, while many proponents of the social gospel embraced various forms or tenets of socialism, only a few others, Richard Ely, W.D.P. Bliss, George Heron, Charles Sheldon, and Walter Rauschenbusch, did as much as Scudder to advance Christian socialism in the years between 1890 and 1920. And yet, inexplicably and certainly inexcusably, Scudder is a neglected voice amongst those other names listed. And that goes back to one of the reasons why we're doing this, because she does not deserve to be as obscure as she is. Scott Smith continues, quote, moreover, she was probably the principal female leader in the Episcopal Church during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, serving, for example, as one of two women on a joint commission on social service established by the denomination in 1910 to promote social reform. So there's a super fast crash course of her life and her career. She's very active. I can't imagine being involved in like one club, and she's involved with like five. So props to her for that. But there's some bio stuff. Anything to add? Anything that stands out to you as significant, Tony?
Well, the you mentioned the influence of Ruskin on her. That went so far as to prompt her to write more than one book on him. Actually, an edited collection of his works, and a book on him. And he's also included in another book of hers on the social character of English letters.
Oh, awesome. Do you
Um,
have that book?
I have her edited collection of Ruskin, but I don't have the other one. Other than a PDF. I do have a PDF of it. Um,
Cool.
so I haven't gotten to that one yet. But I was interested in the collection of Ruskin because I wanted to see how she edited him. As will become obvious when we get to the second chapter, there are actually certain aspects of Ruskin that she came to reject in later life, and this is actually something of a common thread in a lot of Anglican socialism of this time is an initial draw to Ruskin, and then amongst people like R.H. Tawney, Vita Scudder, etc., a a a quickening of the conscience that his particular brand of social reform will simply be unable to bring them the rest of the way, in as much as he continued to defend inherited social hierarchy and didn't really want to upset that.
And that's why they're better than Ruskin, of course.
Right, exactly, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah. The sophomore record of Anglican socialism is definitely better. Okay. Cool. So there's some bio stuff. Let's go into the book, Socialism and Character. It's written in 1911 or 12. I just briefly blanked on that. I think it's 1912.
Yeah, I think it is
Um,
12. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. And that means that is not her first book. I would probably call it like her magnum opus from what I've read of her. I think it's certainly the most central to her overall political and theological vision. It's so good. She's such a good writer, but it's also you called it major earlier. It is a major work. It's dense at times and really requires you to sit with it and chew on every word. So how about we kind of go into the book itself? We're doing chapter 1 in this episode, which even that might be too ambitious, but we'll see what we can do. I got a few things on this, just introducing this book. I'm making this is a bit speculative on my part, but the foreword of Socialism and Character is a letter that she writes to Florence Converse, with whom she lived for like 35 years. But she's writing to Florence from somewhere in Tuscany. And some brief research into her career revealed to me that she took a number of leaves of absence during her time at Wellesley, and one of them, or at least one of them, was to Italy. And one of those leaves was from 1894 to 1896, so well before this book is published. But it makes me wonder if she's writing at least the foreword to this book during that time of recovery in Italy. And anyway, the book opens up with this foreword, and there's this beautiful opener. Quote, she says, "Here on this holy Tuscan mountain, sanctified by the passion of St. Francis, where brown-robed brothers move about in exceeding peace among their peasant friends, and white sheepflocks, the rumor of the modern struggle sounds from very far away." So she's already admitting that the antagonism of the class struggle is very distant from this sort of idyllic Tuscan scene that she's surveying. But she says her hope for this book is that may some readers, lifting their eyes from its pages, gaze as from this lovely Italian height over a sweep of horizon that encircles opposite regions, and see intersecting hill ranges as parts of the same uplift above the plane. And not only is that poetic and awesome, I think that that might actually encapsulate the whole thrust of the book. Her attempt is to bring these opposite regions, these intersecting hill ranges, namely the advance of the kingdom of God as through Christianity, and this emergent class consciousness of the proletariat as it seeks to institute and establish a more just society. Those, I think, are the opposite regions that she is trying to reconcile. And those are the regions that she hopes that will come into clearer view from this holy Tuscan mountain that she's sitting on. So super awesome opener. Anyway, that's the forward.
And the worlds that she's trying to connect, she is the Franciscans that she's surrounded by, and her socialism, because Ivor has this draw to the Franciscans. She's written on Catherine of Siena. She wrote, I believe, on Francis himself, and she's moved by, and this will come through in her narrative, by the passionate, self-sacrificial asceticism and care for the poor that she sees amongst them. And yet she's come to believe through her journey as a socialist that the Christian impulse to mere charity is insufficient to bring about the real ends that she's looking for.
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, lest anyone thinks that she's, trying to, create a tamer, more domesticated kind of Christian politics-ish thing. She says, like, now this is not in the forward anymore. This is actually into chapter 1. She says, quote, "The word socialism, moreover, glows to the writer, not with the delicate rose pink so pleasantly popular, but with a deep, uncompromising red. Be it remembered, nevertheless, that the hue of blood and flame is the hue for the feast days of the Lord and giver of life, the Spirit of Pentecost." So for her to root her vision with this Franciscan ideal, that is not to in any way mitigate the revolutionary thrust of her writing. It's in fact to escalate it even further, linking the liturgical color of Pentecost to the spirit of democracy. So cool.
Right. And she goes so far as to explicitly say that the book represents the point of view of a class-conscious revolutionary socialist. She says that on page 5 of the first chapter. So right there off the bat, she's laying out all of her cards.
Yeah.
If I might return actually to a different quote from the initial letter to her partner Florence. I think that this really helps to point up what she's going to be doing. Right. I know that you already gave a quote. I'm going to give this one as well. She says, "Shall this socialism remain purely political, or shall its rich moral possibilities be fostered and utilized? Shall it be allowed to develop mainly as a negative movement of revolt from an intolerable situation? Or should men rather stress in it the constructive elements related less to the attainment of material decencies than to the upbuilding of character?"
Wow. Yeah.
Right. And so we're going to be moving into this first chapter here, and it is presented as a narrative of the history of socialism as a movement, and also her personal journey as her social class consciousness has developed from various stages to where she feels it is now. And you'll note that she writes as if and under the assumption that socialism is happening, is in the process of being realized, is coming, whether or not it is desired on the view of some Christians. And what she's trying to do is address these Christians and say, look, it is coming one way or the other. And so we have to ask ourselves, who are the kind of people that we are going to be in the wake of this?
Yeah. Yeah, she's not even necessarily arguing for a certain kind of socialist practice.
Hmm.
She is looking out here from Italy or there from Boston, right there in the streets, and the antagonism of capitalism is simply self evident for her. The upward thrust of the working classes is simply what she would expect from capitalist society that she is in. And so, yeah, but I think it's really important. And we'll get to how we can sort of compare Scudder's vision for our with our own context. But even that off the bat is so different from how even writers in the Christian left today will write about these things. And there are maybe some obvious, not very interesting reasons for that, but also some that are worth considering. But yeah, she takes for granted this revolutionary thrust of the working class. So, chapter one, like Tony just said, it's a sort of story of the of just the left overall, but maybe kind of buried in there her own journey as well. So I think Tony and I were talking about this as we were preparing for this episode. The thing that leaped off the page to both of us was the modernity of this book. So you want to go there, Tony?
Yeah, when we hear of post-modernity, right, and we hear of the post-USSR situation, it brings to mind for the intelligentsia such as ourselves, right, the end of history, Fukuyama's sense that there's no higher way that the state can be than how it is now, and any thrust that there had been to history is going to be stopped here, right?
Yeah.
And that is distinctly different than Scudder's perspective, which is one where not only is history moving and in progress, but it's not fixed, it's contingent. There's nothing built into the structure of things that forecloses on the possibility of socialism.
Yeah, Thatcher is not around yet. There is, in fact, an alternative that is available and clearly seen for Scudder. Yeah, for sure. Um, so you mentioned this the contingency of the world that she lives. I'm looking on my pages right now because there's this great line. I've actually used it in a piece for the mag before, but she talks about how it's the quote is something like the only constant is ceaseless flux. So this sense of change, of decay, of dynamism, she takes that not only as like a metaphysical truth, but also a political and social one. And we could perhaps flesh this out. She it's almost like she roots that sense of dynamism in modern society's like discovery of contingency itself. Like perhaps it's the realization that the political order or civil society or political economy, whatever you want to call it, that is not just like a direct correspondence with the natural order. Like the way that societies are organized is not just like etched in stone, like a law of gravity. That and she kind of sees that as the founding awakening, which for her is not too long in the past. You can kind of tell that she seems to suggest that it's more or less the revolutionary moment itself, and that is the uniquely modern moment. Would that sound kind of what she's saying? Do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. When she speaks of the beginnings of socialism as a movement, she speaks of sort of the 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 tinge of the conscience of the moneyed classes, looking at the squalor of the Industrial Revolution and what it's wrought, and in the sense of sort of like realizing what is going on here. This doesn't seem right, and we can do something about it. For me, the to say that it's modern is to say that there is possibility, that that humans can act and are in a certain sense obliged, Christians at any rate are obliged to act in a certain way, But again, whether or not the church is lining up in support, it's happening. And that was something you pointed out in your notes, is that that there's something of a distinct lack of ecclesiology, at least in this first chapter.
Right. Yes. And I think it's a good thing, actually. And we'll kind of probably unpack that as we make our way through. There's this great line on this note in chapter 1. She's recounting some of the pivotal events of her recent past. And so, yeah, we have this modernity, this sense of dynamism. The antagonism of class is becoming more and more pronounced, evident in the world around her. But right when you have already established that, she makes this turn back into the inner life, and she says, "Quote: For these same changes are not merely external. In last analysis, they proceed from within. In final reaction, they transform character. The creation of old age pensions, the evaluation of English land, the capture of an American city by socialists are not only objective facts, they connote interesting things happening to our souls. For what happens to the individual soul is the only matter of real consequence in the world." And I think what's so important about that last line, particularly, is that that is not a quietist statement. We are so accustomed to hear a line like that, that what happens to the individual soul is the only matter of real importance. That is so often evocative of an apolitical sort of escape from struggle. And yet, no, she's saying that it is precisely the radical changes in the material conditions of the social order that are therefore of real consequence in the world, precisely because they transform the character of individuals.
Yeah, she comes really close to saying something that is actually in the political theology of Sergei Bulgakov. If you're familiar with his name, Rowan Williams has an incredible book that introduces his political theology, right? And one of Bulgakov's points is that the ethical life, in a sense, is only possible upon liberation from basic mere existence, right?
Right.
Like it's actually necessary to elevate someone beyond mere subsistence, for their opportunity to explore who God has called them to be and who as a society we can be in order for that to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so on that note, she just makes it very clear again in the first chapter. This is on page 5. She says, quote, "This book proposes to discuss in some detail the probable moral and spiritual results of the social change that seems to be impending. The task is undertaken in the hope of suggesting some points in the practical training of mind and conscience, which the transformation in ethics accompanying any serious economic change should immediately demand." And I love that word demand because it gets to what you just said about the sort of precondition for the moral life or the ethical life being one of a liberation from subsistence or certainly a certain kind of oppression. And so what she's saying here is that just as you said that the moral life sits on top, as it were, of bodily life, to mix metaphors here for Scudder, ethics is like downstream from political economy and not the other way around. It is precisely the economic change, the serious economic change, that induces a corresponding transformation in ethics and a transformation in character.
Yeah, and in this, she's taking out some of the romance around the Christian fascination with individual evangelical poverty, right? A sort of
Yes.
elevation of the individual spirituality. She discusses this as sort of, in a way, being less concerned with the material well-being of the person in need of aid than the salvation of the person giving aid.
Yes. And she roots that in chapter 1 There's an intimate connection between that understanding of either voluntary poverty or almsgiving or charity, and a kind of ineradicable inequality, or like a permanent political order that might as well be the natural order. And I think that's why that understanding of justice or charity won't do anymore, because the rug, as it were, the rug has been pulled out from under the social order. It's been revealed in its contingency, and now, therefore, a a more a more accurate and a more thorough ethical account of charity, justice, etc., is called for.
Yeah, she puts it like this. This is a quote from page 14. That suffering as a whole was an evil to be attacked, that our aim should be less to serve than to abolish it, would have been an attitude inconceivable to the medieval mind.
Right.
Yeah. So that's what she's getting at. And this is she's moving through, again, what she believes are the stages of socialism hitherto. And there's reform, there's philanthropy, and then there's what is impending, like the oncoming revolution, right?
Right. Yeah. And I see that we kind of have maybe a little bit of a time limit on this discussion. So if just to put this in here, as she moves through that sort of account, that story of, an awakening conscience, philanthropy, and reform, what's so like sobering is that even in this early 20th century world, would arguably might have been like the peak of at least the American socialist movement. At least that's kind of what that Smith guy says. There's already kind of a despair, a foreclosure, an abandonment of that. Like the reform people deep down realize that reform is not working. The philanthropists deep down realize that their philanthropy isn't working. And yet, as we are so familiar with, even in our own day, people begin retreating back into like this comfortable rationalization. And I wanted to pull out this one part from chapter 1 that at least spoke to me like in a more immediate contemporary level. There's this sense that life under capitalism induces not only a sense of antagonism and alienation between people, but an alienation within the self. There's this great line. It says, talking about the dream of, whether it's liberation or whatever, it says the dream leads out to the waking spectacle of civilization as it is, incredibly wasteful, impossibly cruel, so complex and seemingly inevitable a thing that the mind was forced to accept as a necessity what revolted the heart as a monstrosity. That divergence, that conflict between the mind's ability to rationalize the world as it is and what sort of repulses and revolts the moral sentiments or whatever, that is a sort of choice that is available to us even now. And if you think about that conflict of the self, that's precisely what, as Christians at least, that unity, that heart, is precisely what we're supposed to be striving for. And yet Scudder is pointing out that life under capitalism inhibits that harmony, inhibits that unity of the self. The mind forced to accept as a necessity what revolts the heart as a monstrosity. And she is lambasting that as she sees it happening in the other kind of noblesse oblige class that she comes from, but is also trying to excoriate for their complacency. Just to pull one thing on that, kind of towards the end of chapter 1, this is such a banger line. She says, as philanthropy begins to subside and reform becomes complacent, she says, quote, the voice of the church murmured in suave, consoling accents that the poor white we always have with us, while the voice of respectable society added in light crescendo the reassuring assertion that human nature would never be changed and that men would always require the fear of starvation for an incentive. That sounds familiar.
Boy, does it indeed. And as we're wrapping up here, want to emphasize that this opening chapter is merely setting the stage, because she's going to go on in the second chapter to discuss in more detail what specifically she finds insufficient in both philanthropy and reform. So we're going to hear about Ruskin, we're going to hear about Tolstoy, and we'll be able to go into more depth on that. But this opening chapter is really a salvo, like pointing us and asking, and I do feel as if it is addressed to Christians primarily, asking Christians at the time, and by the transitive property, us, like, what kind of people, what kind of Christians would we be able to become actually in a society where justice is actually thriving? And that's the question she's putting her mind to. And I love that she's able to judge and sift between options as if this is a thing we can think through and deliberate about and act on, rather than merely, on the one hand, the sort of immutable forces of material, right, sort of immanent dialectic, or on the other hand, laws that are unchangeable, built into the very nature of the cosmos and the human person in general. She's not going either of those directions on this.
No, and to bring it back full circle to one of those quotes you said at the very beginning, she thinks that Christian socialism can be more than a negative project. I think that could be simply stated towards the end is that, right? There can actually be a real sense of constructive thought, a real sense of even transformation, both of character and our own ways of understanding the world. And again, that's because we've already been transformed by this thing called capitalism that melts everything into air, and we can actually be a part of that for something better.
Yep, absolutely. Well, that is going to wrap it up for us on this first episode. We're trying to get our feet under us. This is the first podcast either of us has ever done, and I'm sure as things progress and move along, we'll get a bit more practice on structuring our discussions, and that'll be especially needed as we go into chapters with more meat.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks for joining us on this inaugural episode of the Hour podcast.
Yeah. Cheers. And God bless the revolution.
Absolutely. Bye.